once met a guy who proudly said he'd been abroad because he took a cruise to Hawaii. When I explained Hawaii was still America, he got quiet for a second, then said, "Well, it sure felt foreign. Everyone had accents." Yeah, buddy, that's called vacation, not immigration. A woman in Texas once asked me what language people speak in Alaska. When I said English, she blinked twice and said, "No, I mean like Eskimoish." I said only when ordering at Starbucks, ma'am. My coworker told me his dream was to backpack through South America starting in Spain. I said, "You might want to check a map first." He said, "Oh, I don't need a map. I've got an iPhone." Right. But does your iPhone know continents? I once overheard someone at an airport say, "I can't wait to see the Eiffel Tower when we land in London." I almost said something, but then thought, no, let Paris have one more day of peace. My aunt posted photos from her trip to Puerto Rico with the caption, "Finally left the U." S for once. We didn't have the heart to tell her she just used her US driver's license to get there. Someone in my high school class once said, "I'd love to visit Africa someday." What state is that in? And honestly, at that point, I started thinking geography should be a required vaccine, not a subject. A friend once told me, Canada must be amazing this time of year. All those kangaroos. I asked if he meant Australia. He said, no. I saw it on the Discovery Channel. Sir, that was Discovery, not reality. My neighbor complained that the euro to S currency exchange in Mexico was confusing. I told her Mexico uses pesos. She said, "Oh, is that like Canadian dollars but spicy?" Honestly, can't even argue. A guy on Facebook asked, "Why do Europeans drive so far to get to the beach?" Someone replied, "Because their country fits inside Texas, Brad." He didn't respond. Probably because he was busy trying to find Europe on Google Maps. My cousin once bragged she swam from California to Japan because she crossed a long beach. I said, "You mean the Pacific Ocean?" She laughed and said, "No, it was at low tide." Ma'am, that's a puddle, not an achievement. At a diner, a man told the waitress he was from the country of New Mexico. She smiled politely, but when she came back, she whispered to me, "So, do they need a passport there?" I said, "Only if they're traveling to Old Mexico." My friend thought the Middle East was somewhere in Kansas. When I told him it was across the ocean, he said, "No way." I saw a road sign once. Yeah, that was for East Middle School, buddy. Someone once said, "You can tell Italy's near France because they both have pizza." I had to step back before my brain short-circuited. By that logic, Texas must be near Mexico because we both have tacos and bad drivers. A lady at a museum asked the guide, "So, where's the border between North and South America?" The guide pointed at the map. She said, "Oh, so it's invisible like Wi-Fi." Yeah, and apparently just as misunderstood. A man once said he was planning to visit the European state of Canada. When I told him that's a whole country, he said, "Well, they use the Queen's money, right?" I said, "Not anymore." He gasped, "When did they secede?" Oh boy. A guy in our office thought Egypt was in South America. I asked him why, and he said, "Because mummies are tan." I'm still recovering from that logic. If that's true, then my Uncle Bob's summer tan makes him Greek. Someone once argued with me that Alaska can't be part of the US because it's not touching anything. I said, "So Hawaii doesn't exist." He said, "That's different. It's tropical geography by vibes only." My cousin once said, "Man, it must be so cool living in Europe and being close to Canada." I said, "You know those aren't next to each other, right?" He said, "Then why are they both cold?" Science weeps. I once heard a woman say she wanted to go north from Florida to visit Cuba. When I gently mentioned Cuba's south, she frowned and said, "Well, directions are different on islands, okay? Columbus." A man once said he didn't believe Australia existed because you can't drive there. I said, You also can't drive to the moon, but I'm pretty sure it's real. He said, yeah, but the moon's on TV more. Touche, sir, touche. I asked my uncle where he wanted to retire. He said, somewhere quiet, like the Bahamas, maybe near Arizona. I told him, the Bahamas are islands in the Atlantic. He squinted and said, so, like Florida with coconuts. Honestly, that's not entirely wrong, just geographically heartbreaking. At a gas station, a man asked if he needed to exchange money before crossing from California into Nevada. I said, no, sir, it's still America. He sighed in relief. Good. I left my passport in the glove box. That glove box must hold a lot of dreams. My friend bragged that he'd driven through Europe on Google Earth. He said it counts because he used real roads. That's like saying you've been to space because you watched Interstellar twice. Still, he earned an imaginary stamp in his imaginary passport. A woman once asked me if people in Canada celebrate the 4th of July, but slower because it's colder. I told her they celebrate July 1st, Canada Day. She said, so, like a prequel? Ma'am, I think you just turned history into a movie franchise. Someone asked what language they speak in New Zealand. Before I could answer, another person said, New Zealand? That's just Diet Australia. I said, tell that to a Kiwi. He said, a fruit geography class. We miss you. I once heard a guy say, you don't need a map to find the equator. Just drive south till it gets hot. I said, so you'll stop in Florida? He said, exactly. The man just discovered the equator of Walmart discounts. My neighbor said he wanted to move somewhere cheap, tropical, and European. He picked Greece. I said, that's not tropical. He said, then why does everyone tan there? I guess SPF is the new metric system. A teenager once told me Japan was part of China because they both use chopsticks. I asked if Mexico was part of Italy because they both use forks. He said, maybe in the old days. Somewhere a history teacher just cried in 6 languages. I overheard a guy say, man, I'd love to visit Africa, especially Jamaica. I said, that's not the same continent. He blinked and said, well, they both have lions, right? I said, only in the reggae songs, dude. A woman once argued that Antarctica must be fake because no one lives there permanently. I said, scientists do. She smirked and said, that's what they want you to think. Ma'am, the penguins aren't running a conspiracy. They're just cold. My old neighbor Bob once said he didn't trust Google Maps because it keeps changing. Where countries are? I asked what he meant and he said, last year, Ukraine wasn't even on there. I told him, it's been there the whole time. He squinted and said, then why didn't my globe from 1978 show it? I said, because the Soviet Union was still around. He nodded like I just confirmed a conspiracy. Exactly, he whispered. They're hiding new countries from us. Bob, my friend, the only thing hidden is your high school geography textbook. A woman at my local grocery store told me her daughter was studying international culture in college. Proud mom moment until she added she just learned that Europe and the UK are 2 totally different countries. I smiled and said, well, sort of. She frowned and said, don't start. She already failed her first quiz because the teacher insisted London isn't in France. I said, it's not. Her jaw dropped. You're kidding. Then where's the Eiffel Tower? I said Paris. She gasped. So they moved it.